Shalom, I'm Dr. Dinah Dye with Foundations in Torah, and welcome to a brand new series called Rapture or Bust. Maybe everything you always wanted to know about the rapture, but were too afraid to ask. So I took some time to go through it step by step. We're going to look at various parts of this whole concept of the rapture. Where I'm going to start with is sort of the history of it. Where did it come from? How did we get here? Really, the title of this first session is How Did We Get Here? How did we come to this place? It's not something we actually find in the ancient Hebrew Jewish literature, if you will. Certainly there is a resurrection, there's the ingathering of the exiles, there's a lot of information in the writings, really, something connected to the dew, talking about the resurrection, etc. But really, we don't have anything sort of called the rapture, if you will, which has actually been titled something later from the Latin, raptura. But let's try to go back to the beginning of when we think this doctrine, if you will, got started. And probably the first person is Ephraim of Nisibis. Now, he's a guy, we go back to about the 4th century. He was an early Christian writer and poet. He was very prolific and wrote a lot of poetry. But he would have been a major theologian of what we call the Byzantine Eastern Church, born in the place called Nisibis. It's a Roman province of Syria. Today is present-day Turkey, in a town called Edessa. But this all really began with dear Ephraim and a sermon that he preached. And so things that were taken out of that sermon eventually snowballed. So here's the quote from the sermon that got everything going. He said, "For all the saints and the elect of God are gathered prior to the tribulation that is to come, and are taken to the Lord, lest they see the confusion that is to overwhelm the world because of our sins." And so this particular sermon that he preached, called On the Last Times, was built around the themes of the Antichrist and the end of the world and the tribulation and the 3.5 years. All themes that he wrote about in a book called The Cave of Treasure, excuse me. This was written about 370 of the Common Era, and in it he began to identify Daniel's 69th week. Now, some scholars have suggested that this manuscript was actually, that is, the Cave of Treasures, was written several centuries later, moving into the 5th and 6th century. Although this gentleman, William Bousset, who is considered to be the greatest scholar that there was on ancient eschatology, concluded that the Antichrist legend written by Ephraim was indeed written at the time of Ephraim 370 of the Common Era. And we have a photo here kind of ancient Edessa, Turkey, of what Nisibis would have looked like in the 4th century. He was a Syriac deacon, like I said, a theologian of the 4th century, and prolific in his writings and hymns and poems and prose, etc. But what he really addressed was sort of practical theology for a church that was in trouble. He was from a family of Christians. His parents were they were Christians, very solid in their community. They were very influential in their community. And a lot of the hymns that he wrote were really dealing with sort of false doctrines at the time. He was dealing with a rejection of rationalism and confronting sort of the heresies of Marcion at the time. In fact, it was said that his style of teaching was similar to sort of Jewish midrashic and the Targumic traditions. So that's kind of interesting. Basically, we have, after Ephraim of Nisibis, is a lot of silence on this particular topic or even hinting at it until we get to about the late 1700s. So you see there's a huge gap of about 1,400 years here. And the next person we have come on the scene is a gentleman named Emmanuel Lacunza. Now, he published a work called The Coming of the Messiah in Glory and Majesty. And it was filled with what we call prophetic interpretation. We would call it futurism. Published in about 1812. He was a Catholic priest in Spain. And in this book, The Coming of the Messiah in Glory and Majesty has allusions to the rapture. Now, he picked this up from the sermon that was preached by Ephraim of Nisibis. He was a Catholic Jesuit, and he was one who took on and discussed the events in the book of Revelation. So pretty groundbreaking, I guess, for the time that we're in. He also took on talking about the 3.5 years, the reign of the Antichrist in that time. And so there was a hint during his time of something about the doctrine of the rapture, but really there's sort of a break again, and we don't really hear of it until the time of the Protestant Reformation and the rise of what we call dispensationalism under John Darby. Now, Emmanuel Lacunza was actually a Jew who had accepted Yeshua as his Messiah, but he wrote under the pseudonym Rabbi Ben Ezra, because he felt that by doing so, unsuspecting Protestants would then accept his book, because if he wrote from a Catholic point of view at the time, it wasn't going to go over well. But writing under the pseudonym Rabbi Ben Ezra, he felt he had a better chance here. The Protestant world at the time really wanted nothing to do with the Jesuit priest. Lacunza believed that during the period before the day of the Lord, there would be a general apostasy of the Catholic Church. He was specific in that. And what he was saying in this sense is that the church was not really individuals, but it was more the sort of moral body. And then at that time of the day of the Lord, it would be composed of apostates and atheists, which you can imagine didn't go over too well with the official Catholic Church. And it really put the Catholic Church on the wrong side of the whole thing in the final struggle between good and evil. So this pretty much brought condemnation by the Vatican when this was published. Over the course of time, Lacunza had continual run-ins with the Catholic Church. And basically around 1773, it all blew up. And at that time, the Pope dissolved the Jesuit order, and he did that so that he could give sort of territorial concessions. There was sort of a trade-off here for concessions by France and Spain. And so the whole Jesuit thing was pretty well reduced to secular status. Now, he believed that the end of the world was marked by the resurrection of the dead and the last judgment, and understood that this involved a transmutation of the physical world to the plane of the eternal. So Lacunza understood this, and this is what he wrote about in his book. Now, he said that this event would take place after the 1,000 years of Christ or Yeshua's earthly kingdom. So now, again, we have another little break, and the next guy on the scene is Edward Irving, who is actually born around this time. Now, Edward Irving was born in Scotland. In 1792, he discovered Lacunza's book. He then translated it into English, and then it was published in London in 1827. Edward Irving was a pretty busy guy. He held Bible conferences all through Scotland, and he was one who took Lacunza's work and basically began emphasizing the coming of Jesus, the coming of Yeshua, and the rapture of his church. Now, it was said that in 1830, some gal, now this is probably a legend, we're not sure, Margaret MacDonald was her name, sort of gave some ecstatic prophecy and claimed from this prophecy that there would be some sort of secret, special coming of the Messiah to the rapture, basically to those awaiting his return. So she described this as in terms of the rapture. And so from that point on, from supposedly Margaret MacDonald's ecstatic prophecy of the secret rapture, Edwin Irving he devoted himself really to the rest of his life to this teaching and to spreading this theory of the secret rapture. Now, he was influenced by Lacunza, and he established what we call the Irvingite Church, or it was actually called the Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. This was in 1832. The Coming of the Messiah in Glory and Majesty, which is Lacunza's book, he actually wrote sort of a preliminary or an intro into that book. Eventually, the Catholic Apostolic Church removed him from his center of power, and he eventually died in Glasgow in 1834. He was the one who kind of set the stage to introduce a lot of this to John Darby. So John Darby's kind of the key to this whole thing. And really, when people talk about the rapture and dispensationalism, they end up here. We don't really end up before that, but really everything has been geared and gets us to this particular point. And so Darby sort of developed this system to study prophecy, if you will, called dispensationalism. He's the one who developed it. He organized the writings of Immanuel Lacunza, what we call futurism, and he organized it into sort of this systematic prophetic teaching. And this is what we call dispensationalism. This is around 1820s and 30s. He's the founder of the Plymouth Brethren, and as I said, thought to be really the originator of the rapture doctrine. He was a brilliant scholar, so we can't just totally dismiss him out of hand. However, his scholarly work caused a revival in biblical learning and the evangelical world at the time. So that was significant. Again, he was a brilliant scholar with outstanding scholarly abilities, but we just kind of recognize that he didn't kind of go back to the beginning of all of it. He went back to the works of Immanuel Lacunza. This revival and learning basically spread throughout the evangelical world of the time, and really it paved the way for what we call the renewal of the modern lexical studies in the different biblical language. So this is good. There were things that he did that really, I think this introduction of the lexicons is really very important, and we benefit from it today in that for those of us who don't know Hebrew or Greek or whatever, we have access to lexicons to help us. So this was very important. Again, in the 1820s and 30s, he developed this system called dispensationalism. It was very popular in Christendom at the time, but it had no roots whatsoever in Judaism. So basically, dispensationalism took biblical history and divided it into dispensations or sections that were chronological to deal with the end times view. And it was fairly problematic in a lot of respects. So this particular belief, he is called the father of dispensationalism, but he believed, of course, that the law of Moshe had passed away at the cross, and that we now entered this sort of dispensation called the Age of Grace, or the church age. It had begun. But he had a real problem because he had to deal with Daniel's 70th week, his final week in that prophecy, because the offerings were reinstituted in the temple. So that kind of, what was he going to do with this? Did the law come back into effect after it had sort of ended in the Age of Grace, if you will? So he's also got to deal with the fact that where do you put Jews that are believers in Yeshua? So that do they go in the age of grace, or are they back in the age of the law? When the rapture comes, do they go with the church, but they're not really of the church, or do they stay behind? So these were all questions that he had to deal with. And in the end, he decides that a believer in Yeshua the Messiah actually becomes part of the church and is no longer part of Israel. So we can see this division between the church and Israel is really come about by this teaching of dispensationalism. And then it pretty well infects the church from many different angles going forward. So this is sort of this is the work of John Darby. Now from John Darby, we move forward to another guy, William Eugene Blackstone. Now he's an American, so we've moved this thing out of England and we're moved over here to the United States. He was born in 1841. He was very influenced by Dwight Moody and John Darby. He was, as I said, an American evangelist and what we might call today a Christian Zionist. Very outspoken, an ardent supporter of Zionism. And so when what we call Herzlian Zionism considered an offer by the British government for an interim Jewish state in Uganda, he just was vociferously campaigned against it. And in fact, he sent Herzl, Theodore Herzl, modern-day founder of the State of Israel, a personal Bible that outlined the very specific biblical references to the Jewish restoration to Palestine, as it was called at the time. He continued to popularize this concept of the rapture in his best-selling book of the time called Jesus is Coming, which sold 1 million copies in the late 1800s. Some of us can only dream of this. So this was huge at the time, and selling 1 million copies of this book. This is a book that had a tremendous amount of influence on some of our more present-day writers, such as people like Hal Lindsey. So it didn't come in a vacuum. And from Eugene Blackstone, we moved to another one, C.I. Scofield, who's responsible for the Scofield Reference Bible. And he picks up the rapture doctrine and the whole concept of dispensationalism, and now it enters into the mainstream of Christianity with his Bible, the Scofield Reference Bible. And it is introduced into the United States somewhere between the 1840s and the 1870s. Scofield was a Congregationalist preacher, and he was very much under the influence of Darby and the Plymouth Brethren. So you see how this thing has really gone from not much to really something big. We have another photo here of Scofield. He began to very much incorporate this teaching into this reference Bible. Apparently 3 million copies were published in the first 50 years of his writing it. So they say Scofield very shrewdly carried the teaching of the secret rapture going back to Irving. It became the very heart of evangelicalism. And eventually sort of Scofield and Darby had an influence on D.L. Moody, and then we have the Moody Press, which moves itself into Pentecostal circles. And so certainly by the beginning of the 20th century, this has all come into the publications in Pentecostal charismatic circles, especially in the Assemblies of God, Foursquare, etc. Some of these Pentecostal denominations becomes their Sunday school material. So, needless to say, it's had an influence, but very short. This is really in the course of history, in the course of time. This has really not been very long. It's really been a pretty recent development. So let's just look at some of the definitions here. How do we get rapture? We all know it's not in the scriptures. Really, it's from the Latin rapture. The word Latin rapiere. There's several different versions, but all of them have a similar meaning. Rapiere, to seize or abduct. Rapture, it was Middle French from the same root. Rapiere, raptura meant kidnapping, and in Latin we have raptus, or to carry off. So this is sort of the Latin, and then we'll move into what the Greek is. Certainly the scripture we all end up looking at is from 1 Thessalonians 4:17, and I'm not a Greek scholar, so bear with me. Harpagisometha is the Greek word used. We shall be caught up or taken away, as in a sudden event. A word you might be more familiar with is harpaza, to be snatched away. So that would be the Greek. Now, the Hebrew is the term natsal would probably be our closest, which means to be rescued or to be saved or delivered from danger. In a sense, this is kind of the same meaning as the word we have for salvation, but natsal really in its most basic meaning is to be rescued from or delivered from danger. So you can see already there's a little bit of a difference here between the two, between the concept of rapiere, raptura, and the Greek, and now into the Hebrew. So let's look at some examples here of scriptures that people generally go to when we're discussing the rapture. And my goal, we'll look at these scriptures now, and then we're going to look at them again at the very end to see if we've actually changed our mind about anything. And pretty much in interpreting scripture, whatever your worldview is, how you see things through your lens, is honestly how you're going to see everything. And when we have this is sort of a cultural phenomena, this sort of rapture thing. So if we look at being taken out or left behind, and we've already made these sort of associations, it's pretty hard to break through that. Hopefully I can show you that it's actually the exact opposite of what we've always thought. So if we look over here, the most famous one, I guess, of Matthew 24:37, and it said, "For the Son of Man's coming will be just as it was in the days of Noah. Back then, before the flood, people went on eating and drinking, taking wives, becoming wives, right up until the day Noah entered the ark. And they didn't know what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. And so it will be just like that when the Son of Man comes. Then there will be two men in a field. One will be taken, the other one left. There will be two women grinding flour at the mill. One will be taken and the other one left behind." So when I approached this topic, and I wanted to look at it without an agenda as best I could, and to go back to the very beginning and see where in the Tanakh, where in the scriptures are we talking about this. The key here was really, as it was in the days of Noah, they were marrying and given in marriage. So that we have this sort of connection with they were being betrothed and they were being married. And I thought, well, what's with that? Why is that so important in this verse, especially in the context of what we're talking about? So I went back and I went through the entire story of Noah, and especially pre-Noah, all that went on before that, to try to understand why was this inserted in here and why is it so important. The question that we have as we looked at that last slide, and I had up in yellow and blue, taken was in the yellow and blue was left behind. Who are the taken and who are the left behind, and what does that mean? So obviously, if your bent is towards the rapture theory, the taken is you're removed and the left behind is you're left behind, which is not so good. And so we see things as that many believe that there's this sort of promise for the second chance of salvation for those that are, quote, left behind. And of course, we have all the series on left behind kind of thing and what they'll experience during the 7 years of the tribulation. And so being taken is traditionally is looked at as being removed or, escaping what's going to happen. But I'm thinking that the actual meanings are exactly the opposite. And we're going to go through this and try to lay the groundwork for it. But the concept of left behind or remain is really connected to the remnant. So it's actually a good thing to be left behind, to be a remnant. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but it's that the wicked will be taken. And they will be taken to the place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, and it will be the righteous that remain. The righteous that are the remnant will remain. So as we go through this, I hope you can see. So this is kind of important. Let's go to Hebrews 11. We're going to start moving into, we have to look at some of these scriptures because these are the ones that everyone goes to say that this is this and this means the rapture. So another one would be in Hebrews 11. So let's just read that. "By faith Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God." So now here we see all this taken stuff. So now we've got to look at that in more detail. "And by faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith." So these verses we're going to be talking about this as we go through it. But let's read one more verse here. "Moreover, Hanok or Enoch, in the seventh generation, starting with Adam, also prophesied about these men, saying, "Look, Adonai came with his myriads of holy ones to execute judgment against everyone, that is to convict all the godless for their godless deeds." And one more here, 2 Peter 2:4. And it starts, "And God did not spare the ancient world. On the contrary, he preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, and brought the flood upon a world of ungodly people. So the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from the trials and to hold the wicked until the day of judgment." So Noah is our example of this herald of righteousness. And we saw in there this concept of rescue. In Hebrew, it's natsal, to be delivered. And so I think the key in all this is the story of Noah, because if we're going to have an example of the rapture, if there is such a thing, it's going to have to be in the story of Noah, which has all the elements of the end days, if you will, just the whole progression of things. So we've laid the groundwork. I hope you see the history here of how the rapture doctrine came to be. And now we're going to start talking about, we're going to go back to Noah, and we're going to see how that plays out. So we'll see you next time. Thank you and shalom.